Economic systems, one of my favorite topics in economics and the subject of a lot of my research. What is an economic system? Now, the economic system that we live in right now in the United States in the 21st century is called capitalism. Everybody knows that. Not everybody knows exactly what capitalism is or what makes it different from other economic systems. It's sometimes difficult to explain an economic system to somebody who has never lived in any other economic system, because a lot of the times features of our current economic system just seem like the way things are. But it's important before we move on with the rest of the course to discuss economic systems, because the entire rest of the course from here on out will be about capitalism. It's a course about the principles of macroeconomics, specifically the principles of the macroeconomics of capitalism, or even more specifically, American capitalism. We will be talking about some other countries as well, but only in passing. Mostly the United States. Okay, so basically this is going to be a course about the current economic system that exists in the United States. So before we go into that, let's talk about other economic systems, or even about the concept of an economic system in general. There's a difference between a system and a policy. It can be expressed like this. The income tax rate might be high or it might be low. Whether it's high or low is a matter of policy. Different governments might set it differently. But the fact that an income tax exists, and has existed for over 100 years now, that is a part of the economic system of the United States. In other words, an economic system is something that remains the same. It's the framework that remains the same over a long period of time. How long? Well, that depends, but usually, many generations, 100 years, 200 years, that is how long an economic system usually lasts. Sometimes longer, sometimes even thousands of years. But the idea is that an economic system is that framework for the economy, that framework for economic activity that remains the same from decade to decade, from generation to generation over a long period of time. Whereas economic policies are things that might change from one president to the next, from one generation to the next, even from one year to the next. So how high the taxes are, what the environmental regulations exist, if any. That is a matter of policy. That's something that's subject to change. An economic system is something more like, do we have private property over the means of production or not? Do we have markets or not? Do we have a planned economy? Do we have an economic plan set by a central authority or not? These are aspects of the economic system. So, systems versus policies. The system is the big picture, the big framework. The policies are the small things that can change. The differences between systems are like, the difference between a car and a helicopter. That's like a systemic difference. The differences between policies are like the differences between different kinds of cars. Now, just like there are different definitions of the concept of economic systems in general, but they all get at more or less the same idea. Likewise, there are different ways to classify economic systems. There are different ways to come up with a scheme to look at all of the different economic systems that have existed or that have been proposed by someone, may not necessarily have actually existed. So there are different ways to come up with a scheme to look at all of them and compare them with each other and see what things they have in common and what things are different. One way to do it, of course, is to not have a scheme and to just have a list. You could just list all of the economic systems that have existed in history and all of the ones that somebody has proposed that they think should exist and talk about them that way. So, we could have a list. Slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, post-scarcity communism, etc. The last one being, of course, only proposed and not having existed. So we could do that. We could have a list and leave it at that. But there are also different ways to classify economic systems based on the things they have in common and the things that are different between them. The book gives a very simple classification system, but I'm going to give you a slightly more detailed one that is used by Stephen Gardner in his textbook on comparative economic systems, arguably the book on the topic. So in Gardner's view, there are basically 4 ways that economic systems can differ from each other. There are 4 dimensions along which they differ, 4 axes. And before I tell you what he calls them, here's basically what they refer to. Who makes economic decisions? at least the big economic decisions? Who makes economic decisions for the most part? Who decides what's going to happen in the economy? Next question, how do they decide? How are decisions made about what's going to happen in the economy? After that, why? Why do economic actors act? Those people who are making those decisions, what motivates them? Why are these decisions made? And finally, what? What is the purpose of the economy in the view of the people who are making the decisions? What is the point, I'm asking? These are basically the 4 questions that are answered differently by different economic systems, and that result in there being different economic systems. These are the things that make economic systems different from each other. And now I'm going to tell you what the official names for these questions or categories are. Here they are: ownership, coordination, incentives, and the objectives. Ownership is the question of who. Who decides what's going to happen in the economy? Who makes the decisions? Well, the decisions are made by people who own important assets, who own the means of production, or otherwise said, who own capital. Those 2 phrases, by the way, which you may encounter and you will encounter in economics in the future, capital or the means of production, they don't mean exactly the same thing, but they're very similar concepts. What they refer to is productive property, things that are used to make other things. Land, factories, money can be considered a type of capital sometimes in certain contexts, in the sense that you can use money to buy land or factories or things like that. Of course, you can also use money to buy food, so money is a bit iffy. But the means of production or capital are the things that are used to make other things, productive property. Again, natural resources, machinery, factories, land, those sorts of things. Whoever controls those, whoever has ownership over those, makes all of the important decisions in the economy. So ownership, the question of who makes the decisions? Who owns the means of production? Then you have coordination, the question of how. How are decisions made? Okay, so some people own the means of production. They're not necessarily all friends, or they're not all working together for the same goal. They might be, but not necessarily. So when they have conflicts with each other, when they have different ideas, disagreements about how to move forward, how do they resolve those? How are these decisions coordinated? How are decisions made? Who decides when there's a conflict? Who resolves conflicts, and so on? Then we have incentives. Incentives are the question of why. Those actors, those decision makers that make those decisions, what motivates them? What are their incentives? What makes them do stuff? And then there are the objectives, the question of what. What are those people trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve? What are the objectives of the economy? Why do we have an economy in the first place? These are the 4 questions, the 4 types of categories that differentiate economic systems from each other. And before I start talking about different economic systems like feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, let me give you some examples of different types of ownership, different types of coordination, different types of incentives and objectives. So let's start with ownership. And let's start with the type of ownership that is most familiar to us, people living under capitalism, and that would be private ownership. Simple and straightforward to understand, for us at least. An individual, a person, me, you, or a group of individuals that have banded together, they privately own things, like a factory. A factory can be owned by a person or by a group of people. A coffee shop, a plot of land, an office building, a recording room. These can be privately owned. And most things under capitalism, not all things, but most things, are indeed privately owned. Private ownership means that that individual or that small group of individuals, relatively small compared to the whole of society, who own those things, they can do whatever they want with the property that they own, within certain legal limits usually, but for the most part they can do whatever they want. They can sell it, they can cut it up, they can destroy it, they can consume it, they can make a profit from it, they can derive rent from it, they can rent it to somebody else, and so on. They can lend it out to someone, they can make money from it. The right to use and abuse property is what it's sometimes called. Okay, that is private ownership. Then, of course, there is social ownership. Which is the defining feature of socialism, just like private ownership is the defining feature of capitalism. Social ownership means that the whole of society owns something. All of society. So, for example, something like I'll give you an example from capitalism, because social ownership exists under capitalism too, just like some limited private ownership exists under socialism too. No economic system is some sort of pure thing with only a single kind of ownership. Rather, they have a dominant form of ownership. Most things in capitalism are privately owned, not all of them. Some are socially owned. Most things in socialism are socially owned, not all of them. Some might be privately owned, and so on. So, example of social ownership. Natural parks. Natural parks are the property of the whole of society, and they are administered by a government agency that represents society. Certain waterways and patches of open ocean are also socially owned in our society. In other capitalist societies, you can have socially owned healthcare facilities or schools. So these are things that are legally the property of the whole society and are administered by some sort of agency or institution or organization that represents society, or that is at least supposed to represent society. Now, other types of property ownership. Well, actually, you can have government ownership that is not social ownership. I'm going to call that state ownership. Wait a minute, didn't I just say that socially owned means of production and other things are usually administered by the government on behalf of society? Yes, of course. But you can also have things that are owned by the government, explicitly by the government, not by society, that are not administered on behalf of anybody else, things that the government administers on behalf of itself, things that the government is trying to make a profit off of. There are really no good examples of that in the United States right now. But there are other countries that have, say, for example, a state-owned oil industry that makes a profit. You know, it's not, it doesn't exist for the purpose of providing oil to the people. It exists for the purpose of extracting oil and making money off of it. And that money goes into the budget of the government. So in that sense, you can have a state ownership that is not social ownership, that is not the government owning something on behalf of society, acting as a steward, but rather the government just making a profit off of something, whether it's oil or something else. Oil is the most common example in the world right now. Other types of ownership. Well, in feudalism, you had something that we might call family ownership. Now, that's kind of like private ownership, just like social and state sometimes are difficult to differentiate. Likewise, private and family are sometimes difficult to differentiate. But the idea behind family ownership is that a thing like a castle, let's say a feudal, medieval castle, is owned by a family, not by a specific individual, not by a specific person in that family, not even by a specific group of people in that family. It's not owned by me and my brother and my cousin and my uncle together, we are the owners of this castle. No, this castle is the property of our family, the Tudorano family. And anyone who is a member of this family can have a say in how this castle is run, at least in principle. Somebody is running the castle at the moment, but that somebody acts or is supposed to act on behalf of the family, and if the rest of the family thinks that this person does not act in their interest, then they can challenge him and they can remove him, replace him with some other member of the family. There can be internal conflicts within the family about the use of the family's property and who is doing a good job of that and who is not, and so on. So you have this concept that the property belongs to the family, not to any specific individuals within that family, and should be used by those individuals for the good of the family. You know, the sort of thing that Tywin Lannister would do. All right, so those are some types of ownership. There are other types of ownership as well, sometimes more unusual, more complicated, but we don't need to go into those. Let's go into types of coordination. Now, the types of coordination, this is actually how your textbook, chapter 1.4, describes economic systems. That textbook basically just looks at coordination, does not look at ownership or anything else. It just looks at coordination, and it says that you can have the following types of coordination, or the following types of economic systems. There's traditional economic systems, or using tradition as a form of coordination. What do we mean by that? Now remember, coordination is the question of how are decisions made. To say that tradition is a means of coordination is to say that we do the same thing today that we did yesterday. You know, decisions are made according to tradition, according to what we did last year, we still do it this year. Obviously, nothing ever stays precisely the same. No economy, no matter how traditional it may be, is going to literally repeat year after year exactly the same. But an economy that uses tradition as a method of coordination tries to keep things the same year after year, and where they change only by accident, because the weather changed, because there was a war and they had to fight off an invasion, because some new deposit of some new metal was discovered somewhere. Things change, or somebody made a new invention by accident. Things change by accident. And in general, we try to keep things as much as possible the same. That is tradition. That is essentially the method of coordination that dominated for most of human history, for most economic systems that existed before the Industrial Revolution. That was the a form of the method of coordination that existed under feudalism, for example. You are a carpenter. Your father was a carpenter. Your son will be a carpenter. We're trying to keep things traditional. We're trying to keep things the same. Now, at some point down the line, some member of your family might stop being a carpenter for whatever reason. Tradition isn't perfect, but we will try to more or less keep things the same as much as we can. Now, if you're going to say, wow, that sounds awful, why would anyone ever want an economic system coordinated by tradition? The answer to that is, remember the kind of world we're talking about before the Industrial Revolution. Most people are engaged in the production of food. And the primary concern, even in agricultural societies, is staying alive, having enough food to live. In that context, doing the same thing year after year isn't necessarily a horrible thing. It means that, hey, last year we grew enough food to make sure that everyone stayed alive. Let's try to keep things as much as possible the same so that this year we can all stay alive as well, so that one of us doesn't die. So in a situation where survival is the main goal, and there's a real danger of death for some people, at least, maybe for many people, if something goes wrong, then you might not want to risk much. You might want to keep things as traditional as you can in the hope that this way there's going to be survival. Nobody will die. So in that context, tradition actually makes a lot of sense. Obviously, in a context where you don't have to worry about anyone dying, then tradition seems like, unnecessarily constraining. All right, another coordination mechanism, the one that we use in the United States right now, the one that is used in capitalism, markets. Coordination by markets means that you have an economy where there are different firms, different organizations, let's say, competing with each other. And these are not necessarily privately owned, because we can combine different ownership systems with different coordination systems, but they're owned by somebody, okay? These different firms that are competing with each other, they're owned by somebody. Maybe one of them is an oil company owned by a state. And they are trying to sell things. They're producing things, and they're trying to sell things for the highest profit that they can make. That is, in a nutshell, how market coordination works. You have competition between different organizations, private or state or otherwise, And these organizations are all trying to make a profit by selling stuff that they produce. Finally, another coordination system is planning or command, but I will call it planning. And you'll see why I call it that and not command in a moment. Planning, coordination by planning, is a situation where you have an economy where a plan, a single plan is made regarding what we're going to do this year, for example. I pause there for a second because there are different ways to reach that plan. But the idea is that for each year, or for every 5 years, let's say, we're going to have a plan that says, oh, in this period, in this year, or in this 5 years, we're going to make this many television sets, this many computers. We are going to schedule this many flights of airplanes, of passenger airplanes. There will be this many new students enrolled in university, and so therefore we need to hire this many professors to teach them. There will be this many new doctors hired, and everything that goes along with that. We are going to make a plan. We're going to make a plan for a year, just like you would have a family budget or a family plan regarding what you expect to make in a given year. You might have that. We're going to do that for the entire economy. We're going to plan out a year or 2 years or 5 years in advance and decide, bam, 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 bam. This is what we're going to produce. And then at the end of that period, or near the end of that period, we're going to look back, see if we actually achieved the plan or not, see where there were shortcomings, and then we're going to make a plan for the next period that will hopefully be better than the last. That is planning. Now, the thing about planning is, there are different ways to reach that plan, right? Then there's the question of, okay, so if there's a plan for the whole economy where we decide what we're going to do for a certain period of time, who makes that plan? Well, you can have centralized or decentralized planning. Centralized planning, also known as command, as a method of coordination. Centralized planning is when you have a single central authority, like a government, like a federal, an overarching government or a dictator, that just decides what the plan is going to be. And that is the economic system that, that's the method of coordination that was used, for example, in the Soviet Union. But it was also used in conjunction with tradition in a place like ancient Egypt, for example. So that is centralized planning. You have a plan, and that plan is made by a single authority. You can also have decentralized planning. Also called participatory planning. Decentralized planning is where, rather than having a single central authority that comes up with a plan and tells everyone, this is what we're going to do for the next 5 years, you have various different organizations, individuals, voting groups, perhaps different political parties or different labor unions, come together and argue. They have to debate, and come up with a plan, a compromise plan that combines all of their ideas or combines some ideas from everybody. Decentralized or participatory planning. There are different ways to do this. This is part of many proposed systems, of many proposed types of socialism. So decentralized or participatory planning. A proposed way to come up with a coordination system of planning that isn't top-down, that takes into account different interest groups, different parts of society. They come together, they reach some sort of compromise. The next thing that can differentiate economic systems from each other is incentives. Now, incentives are basically of 3 kinds. And when we talk about incentives, we talk about what motivates people. Why do people act? Why do people do what they do? Why do people compete in a market? Why do people bother to fulfill the plan? Why do people bother to follow tradition? For example, Why do people do what they do? The three types of incentives are, first of all, coercive, or coercion as an incentive. Coercion is when you do stuff because you have to, because you're forced, usually by some human authority, although nature can play a coercive role as well when you're going to die if you don't do something for some natural reasons. This usually goes in conjunction with tradition in traditional societies. The incentive to follow tradition is sometimes natural coercion. That is to say, you better do this year or else we're all going to freeze to death next winter. So, that type of coercion. But most of the time, coercion is imposed by a human authority. In other words, a government or some other authority that says, you are going to do this, you are going to follow tradition because otherwise we're going to put you in jail. You are going to start a firm and compete in a market because otherwise we're going to put you in jail. Yes, that does happen sometimes. You are going to follow that plan because otherwise we're going to put you in jail. That is coercion. Now, coercion doesn't necessarily have to take the form of we're going to put you in jail. Coercion can also be more like you're going to do that thing or else we're going to impose a higher tax rate on you. We're going to impose some sort of punishment. The punishment doesn't have to be jail. It can be a monetary punishment. It can be a fine. It can be anything. If you're doing something out of fear of a threat of punishment or out of fear of a negative consequence, bad things happening to you, then that is coercion. Then there are material incentives. Material incentives is when you do something because you hope to gain from it. Now, usually, of course, we think of money when we think of material incentives. You do something in order to make money. It doesn't have to be that, though. Material incentives could also be in kind. It can be, you do something because if you do it, then your neighbor will give you 5 chickens. Yeah, that's not money, but that's a material incentive. Or you do something because if you do it, then you will get a bigger and nicer house or a bigger and nicer apartment from the government. That's not money, but that's a material incentive. So material incentives are anytime people do something in an economic system for gain, out of the desire to gain something. And an economic system where that is dominant can be said to be an economic system that relies largely on material incentives. By the way, that applies to both socialism and capitalism. In both cases, people mostly work for a wage, for money. Now, how that wage is determined differs between the two systems, of course, but it's a wage, it's a sum of money. You work for it, you get the money. That's a material incentive for most people. And finally, the third type of incentives, moral. This is where people do things essentially out of the goodness of their hearts. Now, economists have a problem with that because of our assumption that, or the assumption in mainstream economics that people are self-interested. But if you think about it, in any economic system, in any economy, there are a lot of moral incentives and situations where people do things basically out of the goodness of their hearts. I mean, charities work that way. Charities are based on that. Sure, they're not a big part of the economy, but they exist. In traditional economies, moral incentives often played a role. You do something for the good of the community. In socialist societies, in socialist economic systems, moral incentives play a role. You do something for the good of the people. You do something because this is needed for society. Again, moral incentives. Now, if it's coerced, if it's you better do this because we say so, then that's coercion. But moral incentives can exist by themselves without coercion, whether it's volunteering or donating to charity or doing something for moral reasons. That's a moral incentive. The one economic system where moral incentives might be dominant is the one presented in Star Trek, actually, or at least in the Next Generation era of Star Trek. It's the one where people, it's a post-scarcity society, and people do things, people have jobs in order to benefit humanity or to benefit the whole federation, in order to benefit their neighbors, in order to improve themselves. That's a very, fictional type of society, but it exists as an idea. And it's in a post-scarcity world where all of your material needs are taken care of, that might actually happen. People might do things solely out of the goodness of their hearts because why not? But that's for the distant future. Now, let's talk a little bit about objectives. And I say a little bit because I'm not actually going to put anything on this list because objectives can be so numerous. When we talk about objectives, we talk about what is an economy trying to achieve. Well, anything and everything, depending on the economic system. Even within an economic system, there can be many different kinds of objectives. We might have an economy where what we want is improvements in welfare. We want people to be better off, and that is why we have the economic system that we have, because we think it will lift poor people out of poverty, it will make a lot of people better off. Welfare, that's one reason to have an economic system. That's one type of objective. We might have, as another type of objective, conquest. Historically, that has been a major reason to have a specific economic system. The desire to have an economy that can enable you to have a large army so you can go out conquering places. Bad, but a major part of world history. Conquest as an objective, or national power. Individual freedom can be an objective. We can say, we want to have this system that we have, whatever it is, because we think that this will maximize the amount of freedom that people have. Maybe it won't make them rich, but it will make them free. That's an objective. That's a reason. Equality. We want people to have equal living standards, or at least something close to equal living standards. That's an objective. That's a reason to have a certain type of economic system. And some will produce more equality than others, certainly. And so on and so forth. Basic needs met. That kind of overlaps with welfare. We want to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met, most of all. And if we get anything above that, good. If not, no harm done. That's another objective. There are many, many different objectives that can exist. Okay, so these are the four main things that can separate, that can differentiate economic systems from each other. So now let's look at just three economic systems: feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, and see how they differ based on these different criteria, based on these categories. Before we do that, however, I have a question for you. What is a mouse? No, you heard me correctly. That wasn't that wasn't a mistake. What is a mouse? Now you might ask, wait a minute, what does that have to do with economics? It does, and you'll see why in a moment. Now answer the question. What is a mouse? Some of you, maybe even all of you, will say a mouse is a rodent. It's a small creature, small mammal that scurries around, sometimes found in people's homes, eats cheese. Yeah, no, that's true. That is a mouse. But others might say a mouse is a computer device that is used to input information into a computer. It's used by the computer user to move a cursor on the screen of a computer. And that's also true. Both of those things are called a mouse. Now, they don't really have anything in common with each other. One is a little rodent, the other one's a piece of computer hardware. Now, the piece of computer hardware was called a mouse because it has a tail and it moves around on the desk, I guess. It's a very vague connection, very distant sort of like aesthetic connection. But they're really completely different things, an animal and a piece of computer hardware. But they are called the same thing. They're both called a mouse. It's spelled the same way, it's pronounced the same way, not just in English, but in other languages as well. So, here's a connection with economics. What is socialism? You see? There are different things that have been called and are called socialism. Actually, the same holds true for capitalism, but I'll focus on socialism here. because the difference is bigger when it comes to socialism, the gap between the different things that have been called to that. Just like with a mouse, where there isn't a single correct thing, there isn't a single thing that's called a mouse. There are legitimately two different things that are both called a mouse. The same could be said for terms like socialism, and like I said, maybe even capitalism, but definitely for a term like socialism. There are different things, very different things, that are called socialism. Which one of them is true socialism? Well, I don't know. What is a true mouse? Which one is the true mouse? The animal or the piece of hardware? I don't know. They're both called a mouse. You could argue that the animal was the original thing that had that name, and that's true. And likewise, there is such a thing as the original thing that was called socialism, which is actually what I'm about to talk about when comparing it with capitalism. The thing that was originally called socialism, yes. But just like there's a thing that was originally called a mouse, and now there's a second thing, a piece of computer hardware. Likewise, there was a thing that was originally called socialism, and now there's actually several other things, especially in the present-day United States, where a welfare state is often called socialism. There is no true meaning of that word, or any other word for that matter. I could give you other examples of words that have nothing to do with economics or politics, that have different meanings depending on context. You know, if somebody is talking about a mouse and says that they have a mouse in their kitchen that just ate some of their cheese, then they're probably talking about an animal. If somebody says that they have a mouse connected to their computer, then they're probably talking about the device. I hope, anyway. Likewise, with terms such as socialism. They can mean completely different things, and you just kind of have to figure out which one of the different things the person's talking about based on context. And if you can't figure it out, just ask. So, there are different definitions, or rather there are different things that are called by the same name. There are different things that are called by the same name. I will focus on one of them. I'll focus on the original meaning of the word socialism when it was first used in the 19th century, which is still the dominant meaning of the word worldwide today, but perhaps not so much in the United States, where in the United States other meanings have also risen to prominence. So, with that, let's talk about a few different economic systems. All right, so here we are. Oh, you can't see me. That is fine, because I want you to see this table first before I get into the picture. All right, so we're going to talk about these three systems, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, and about their various characteristics with regards to ownership, coordination, incentives, and objectives. Now, you will notice that capitalism and socialism, or you should notice that capitalism and socialism are industrial economic systems. They have only existed, and they only can exist in industrial societies. Whereas feudalism is an economic system that existed in the past in agricultural societies. So that line over there between feudalism and capitalism should actually be like a reinforced double line, and stronger than the line between capitalism and socialism, because we're talking about the difference between agricultural societies, in this case only one type we're going to be talking about, feudalism, and industrial societies, two types of them, capitalism and socialism. So with that, let me get into the picture. All right, so let's start with one thing, perhaps the most important thing, when we talk about these three economic systems, ownership. Who owns productive property? Who owns the means of production? Who owns capital? Well, starting with feudalism, starting with the last form of agricultural society that existed, ownership can be family ownership, oftentimes, and also private ownership. Individuals own things as well. Stephen Gardner also talks about a concept called private ownership shared with superiors. And we won't go into that, but that's the concept that, you know, there's just like family ownership is owned by the whole family. You can have feudal ownership where the feudal lord has a certain say in what you do with the land, but you also have a certain say in what you do with it. We're not going to go into those details, just going to point out that there's family ownership and private ownership and maybe other more complex forms in feudalism as well. Now, with regards to capitalism, of course, everybody knows one of the defining features of capitalism is the fact that it features private ownership of the means of production. So, private. Now, I think I mentioned this before, and I think I'm going to mention it again. Here we're talking about the dominant type of ownership. Every time we talk about economic systems, especially if we're talking about how they exist in the real world, but even theoretical models of them, they're going to be a combination of different things. Capitalism, not everything is privately owned under capitalism. Not everything is socially owned under socialism. But most things are. So that's what we're talking about here. Most things. So then moving on to socialism, I just said the word a moment ago, in fact. In socialism, the dominant form of ownership is social ownership, which is where it gets its name, of course. That's where it gets the name. Capitalism gets its name from capital. It's not privatism, it's capitalism. I don't know why. Anyway. So, in socialism, the dominant form of ownership is social ownership. In other words, the means of production, productive property, capital, is owned legally by the whole of society, and there is some sort of agency, usually a government agency, but not necessarily. There is an agency of some kind that administers this property on behalf of society. And that agency, at least in principle, should be able to be removed or changed if it does not do a good job. That is where the idea of democratic socialism comes from. The idea that if you're going to have social ownership and there's going to be an agency that is in charge of this socially owned property, then presumably the people, the society, has to have some democratic means of replacing them if they don't do a good job. Okay. Then you have the issue of coordination. How are decisions made in these economic systems? We know who makes the decisions. Families and some private owners in feudalism, private owners in capitalism, society and the representatives of society in socialism. Okay, that's who makes the decisions. But how are the decisions made? Well, in feudalism, of course, it's an agricultural system. It's a system used in agricultural societies, so one of the main methods of coordination is going to be tradition. Perhaps I should have just left it at that and just said tradition. But markets also play a role, although a small role, in feudalism, and even a little bit of planning on the level of a manor, a castle, an estate. Not a whole country, of course, but like a small estate. That can play a role. So I'm going to say tradition plus others. Tradition is really the main one. That's for feudalism. And really, in terms of coordination, most agricultural societies are going to rely mainly on tradition. Now, capitalism. Well, this makes it easy. Markets. Markets are the main, by far, the dominant mechanism of coordination under capitalism. We talked about them just a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to repeat myself. Now, there are types of capitalism, subsets of capitalism, where a certain type of planning can also play a role, especially indicative planning, like in post-World War II France, for example, where the government made a plan that you didn't have to follow, but if you did follow it, you were rewarded. So that can also play a role in some types of capitalism. And most of all, planning can play a role in capitalism during wartime. The economy of the United States during World War II, for example, was capitalist. It was privately owned. However, because of the needs of the war, the government made certain plans and imposed those plans on a lot of industries and a lot of companies. So yes, markets are the dominant form of coordination under capitalism, but not everything is coordinated according to markets. There can be a little bit of plan, and there can be a little bit of tradition as well. Now, socialism. Here we're actually going to run into a bit of a controversy, because there are different types of socialism. There are different types of socialism that use different coordination mechanisms. the mainstream and the most common form of socialism, both in real application and also in the sense that the most common in the sense that it's the one that most socialists support, however, relies on planning. So I'm going to put here planning. Again, socialism as it was originally conceived in the 19th century, and the socialism that was supported by most socialists in the 20th century, and the socialism that was enacted in most countries that were socialist, relied on planning as a coordination mechanism. Certainly the Soviet model of socialism, which is the most widely known form, relied on planning. Specifically in that case, centralized planning or command. Incentives. Well, in feudalism, what are the incentives? Coercion, certainly. You better do what the feudal lord says. But also material incentives. There is material benefit in growing your crops and having enough food to go around, and maybe even bartering for other items that you need. So material incentives played a role in feudalism as well. In capitalism, obviously material incentives, specifically profit for businesses and wages for employees, are the main incentive. And likewise in socialism, actually. You'd think that I might say something different, but in this case, no. Material incentives are actually used in socialism just as much as they are in capitalism. Certainly, if we're talking about wages. There's this misconception about socialism that many critics of socialism say, but sometimes even advocates of socialism who haven't really studied it very well, will say that, oh, in socialism everyone makes the same wage, or in socialism everyone is equal. No. No socialists have ever, or no socialist leaders, no socialist theorists or economists have ever advocated a system where everyone makes the same wage or where everyone is perfectly equal. They have advocated a wage scale that is much more egalitarian than in capitalism. In other words, they have advocated that differences should be smaller than they are in the capitalism, but they have always admitted that some differences must exist and some differences will always exist in terms of wages. And in fact, the main criticism that socialists have against capitalism is not about differences in wages. Rather, it is about profits. It's about company profits. So in other words, socialists traditionally, and most socialists today as well, will say that different workers making different amounts of money in terms of wages is perfectly fine. The one thing they oppose in capitalism is not that some wages are higher than others. What they oppose is that there are billionaires and millionaires and people making profits, not wages, profits from owning large corporations, from owning companies. So, traditionally, and for the most part, continuing today, socialism is not about equalizing wages, it's about getting rid of company profits and keeping wages more or less the same as they are under capitalism. And indeed, the main differences in wealth in capitalism don't come from different wages. They don't come from the fact that some people have higher wages than others. The main differences in capitalism come from the fact that some people have wages and other people have profits. Other people have entire companies that they own and derive profits from, which, profits are not wages. That's a different type of income. Okay, so material incentives also played the main role under socialism. Now, there's also the issue of moral incentives. I'm going to write that in a smaller font. Because there have been socialists historically that have argued that in socialism, people, or at least some people in some circumstances, should be motivated to work just out of the goodness of their hearts for the benefit of society. That has never been a dominant idea in socialism, and it has never really been implemented in any real-life social society, possibly because it cannot be implemented. But it's there. It has been proposed from time to time. Speaking of moral incentives, this might be a good time to differentiate between the terms socialism and communism, which is, of course, not on this table. This is a bit of that issue that I mentioned a few moments ago with the mouse. You know, what do we mean by communism? Basically, there are two very different meanings that have been given to the word communism. The most common meaning now, the most widespread meaning, is to use that word to refer simply to the type of society and economy that existed in the Soviet Union and other countries following its model in the 20th century. That is more properly called Soviet socialism, or the Soviet model of socialism. But hey, it's the most common meaning now, so you know, if the computer device is called a mouse, then we should call it a mouse. The original meaning of communism, as it was put forward by communist theorists in the 19th century, however, referred to the idea of a post-scarcity society, a society, or if not completely post-scarcity, then mostly post-scarcity, the type of society where all material needs would be met. Because we just have developed technology to such a degree that we have, well, they wouldn't have called it replicators because it was the 19th century, but that was basically the idea that they had. You know, that one day we will have automated factories or something, whatever they imagined back in the 19th century, that would pretty much just produce all of the material objects that we need. So we will move past scarcity, at least in that way. Other things might still be scarce, but at least material things won't be. That was the kind of society that they called communism, that the original communists called communism. And they acknowledged that it would be somewhere far in the future. And the reason I mention that is because in that kind of society, of course, the main incentives would be expected to be moral rather than material, because it's post-scarcity, so all material needs are met. So you could say that under socialism, material incentives dominate, but under communism, if I were to put it here, it would be kind of the same as socialism, except moral incentives would be the dominant ones. So you could say that that's the difference between communism and socialism, at least as the words were originally used by their original advocates back in the 19th century. Material incentives versus moral incentives, and the rest would be more or less the same. All right, now objectives. You know what, for objectives, I'm not even going to write anything because, like I said earlier, objectives are so numerous and they can differ within different societies. In feudalism, for example, survival, you know, just making sure that people have enough food to live was certainly a main objective of the economy. Conquest, military conquest, that was a big deal for feudal lords going to war with each other. Those were kind of it. In capitalism, the main objective, well, it depends on the type of capitalism that you're talking about, but it can be anything from welfare, just general human welfare, especially in social democratic capitalism with high taxes and the large provision of social services for the poor. It can also be individual freedom. It can also be innovation. Capitalism is very good at innovating. So all of those things can be considered objectives of capitalism. And again, some advocates of capitalism and some types of capitalism will focus more on some of those than on others. More on welfare and less on individual freedom, or more on innovation and less on individual freedom. It depends. In socialism, the objectives are almost always some variant of welfare, or equality, or some other thing related to that. The idea behind socialism is always, in some sense, to have an economic system that benefits all of society, especially the poor. That's always the objective. Now, it's expressed in different ways. Like I said, welfare is not the same as equality, but that's the general idea in socialism. That's the general reason why socialists advocate for socialism. Okay, so these are the differences between these three economic systems. As you can see, there are similarities as well. You know, there are no such things as opposites when it comes to economic systems. Capitalism and socialism are often presented as opposites, but they do have some things in common, especially incentives, material incentives. They have another big thing in common, which is that they're both industrial economic systems. They're economic systems for industrial societies, which is very much unlike feudalism, which is for an agricultural society. So from the perspective of someone living in 500 years ago, in an agricultural society, capitalism and socialism would look more similar than different. Again, there are really no such things as opposites when it comes to economic systems. So, here we are. We have reached the end of this video and the end of week 2. I'm going to walk off the screen for a moment just so that you can see the table more clearly. And I will see you next week. Now, don't forget that at the end of this week, there is actually a quiz, the first quiz of the semester. So, if you have any questions about that, as always, write to me in the virtual office forum or email me. And have a good week. And of course, happy Labor Day. See you next time.